The Hungriest Man in History. The Strange Life of Tarrare. There are some lives in history that seem to resist belief. Not because they are grand or heroic, but because the details are so strange that even when they are written down, they still feel like rumor. Tarrare was one of those lives. In late 18th century France, he became known for a hunger that appeared to have no natural limit. He was said to eat astonishing amounts of food and remain gaunt. Doctors studied him, crowds paid to watch him, soldiers tried to use him, and by the end of his short life, he had become one of history's strangest medical mysteries. What makes Tarrare so unsettling is not just the appetite itself, it is the feeling that his body had turned against him in some deep and incomprehensible way, and that he was trapped inside a condition no one around him could explain and no one could cure. Most of what we know about him comes through the later account of the military surgeon Pierre-François Percy, so the broad outline appears real even if some of the more vivid details were sharpened by retelling. Even the name itself is uncertain. He might have been Tarrare, but we don't know for sure. He was born around 1772, probably near Lyon in France. Very little about his early life is known with certainty. But the central fact of his life seems to have been clear from the beginning. From an unusually young age, he was always hungry. Later accounts claim that, even as a teenager, he could eat vast quantities of food, far more than should have been possible for a boy of his age and size, and yet remain alarmingly thin. Whether every detail is exact is impossible to say, but the larger picture is consistent. His appetite was not merely large, it was abnormal enough to make ordinary life nearly impossible. Eventually, his family could no longer afford to feed him, or chose not to, so they booted him out. That was the first great fact of Tarrare's life. Whatever was happening to him, it happened in a world with almost no way to understand it. 18th century France had no modern endocrinology, no meaningful grasp of neurological disorders, no real treatment for a condition like his, and little sympathy for the poor when they seemed frightening or unnatural. If you were strange and destitute, you were unlikely to be helped. You were more likely to be stared at. Now, that isn't to say that people in France didn't care about him. I'm sure there were kind people in his life, and I hope he had moments of warmth and a hand up here and there, but to this day we see how homeless people are treated, and it's not very good, and if you go back a couple of centuries, there's going to be even less understanding. And so Tarrare drifted into the margins. According to Percy's account, he fell in with beggars, thieves, and other wanderers. At some point, he discovered that his condition could be turned into a living. So, he became a street performer. That was the role society found for him. Spectacle. A grotesque show. People gathered to watch him eat. Reports say he swallowed huge quantities of ordinary food, and over time the stories surrounding him grew more and more lurid. Even if some of those stories were exaggerated, the underlying reality seems clear enough. His appetite was so unusual that it became a public attraction. By 1788, he was in Paris, performing there. At some point, one account says he developed a severe intestinal obstruction after swallowing foreign objects and had to be taken to the Hôtel Dieu hospital. He survived, but returned to the only life available to him, letting people watch in fascinated disgust. Then came the Revolution's wars. In 1792, France was fighting foreign powers in what became part of the War of the First Coalition. And like many poor young men, Tarrare enlisted in the French Revolutionary Army. The army may have offered food, clothing, and structure, but for Tarrare, it solved nothing. Standard rations were nowhere near enough. He reportedly begged other soldiers for scraps, scavenged constantly, and remained unsatisfied. Eventually, he collapsed from exhaustion and was taken to a military hospital at Sous-Souffray. There, at last, Tarrare passed fully into the historical and medical record. At the hospital, he came under the care of military doctors, including one Pierre-François Percy, whose later memoir remains the main source for nearly everything known about him. Percy and the other surgeons were baffled. Before them was a man who seemed emaciated, physically depleted, and yet capable of consuming astonishing amounts of food. They described him as being of average height but extremely thin, around 100 pounds, that's about just under 50 kilograms. His face was said to be oddly formed, with hollow cheeks and an unusually wide mouth. When he had not eaten, his skin reportedly hung loose from his body. After meals, his abdomen was said to swell outward. He was described as constantly warm or hot, heavily sweating, and afflicted by such a foul odor that others found it difficult to remain near him. After eating, he supposedly grew even more malodorous. His eyes reddened and he fell into a sluggish, exhausted state. Now, one thing, please keep in mind that these details come through old medical writing and should be treated with some caution. A grain of salt, if you will. But Percy clearly believed he was observing something real and deeply unusual. So, the doctors tested him. They gave him food under controlled conditions. One famous report claims he consumed a meal meant for many laborers. Other stories say he swallowed things no one could expect a human being to consume. These are the details that dominate modern retellings, and they are also the ones that deserve the most caution. But the fact of the matter is, apparently the men observing Tarrare believed his hunger was no fraud. However embellished the legends became, they thought they were dealing with a man whose appetite defied ordinary explanation. And then someone had an idea. It was wartime. Armies were improvising, and Tarrare's strange ability to swallow objects suggested a bizarre military use. If he could swallow a container and later pass it, then perhaps he could serve as a courier behind enemy lines. It's one of those ideas that sound clever only so long as no one imagines the reality of it. According to Percy's account, a message was sealed inside a small wooden box, which Tarrare swallowed. He was then sent toward enemy territory disguised as a peasant. The plan was for him to carry the message through his body and retrieve it later. The mission failed almost immediately. Tarrare reportedly spoke no German, behaved suspiciously, looked strangely, and was quickly detained by Prussian forces near Landau. Now, despite his troubles, he was still a good patriot and refused to explain himself. Then, after a beating and about a day in custody, he confessed. The Prussians waited for the message box to emerge. When it finally did, they opened it and discovered that the message inside was essentially worthless. Apparently it was a test dispatch meant only to see whether he could perform the task at all. Tarrare had not simply been used, he had been used experimentally and for almost nothing. According to the traditional account, the Prussian commander ordered him hanged and then changed his mind and released him after another severe beating. When Tarrare returned, he begged Percy to cure him. That may be the saddest turn in the entire story. Beneath all the spectacle and disgust, there was still a man who seems to have understood that whatever was happening inside him was destroying his life. Percy began trying to suppress Tarrare's hunger. According to the later account, he first treated Tarrare with laudanum, essentially a tincture of opium and alcohol. It did nothing. He then tried wine vinegar. That failed as well. After that came tobacco pills, which were also useless. Finally, Percy fed him large quantities of soft-boiled eggs, hoping at least to dull the appetite. That failed too. Nothing held. The doctors also tried to keep him on a controlled diet, but this proved impossible. Tarrare snuck away to search for food wherever he could find it. Outside butcher shops, in garbage piles, in gutters, outside homes, anywhere he might find some scraps. By this point, the condition no longer looked like a strange public act, it looked like a complete enslavement to hunger. Some of the darkest stories date from this period. Hospital staff later claimed that Tarrare tried to drink blood from patients during bloodletting and was found near corpses in the morgue. Again, I just want to stop and emphasize that we should take these reports with a grain of salt, because these accounts come down through the same narrow source tradition as the rest of the case, and we need to be careful. Still, with that said, they show how deeply his reputation had darkened. To the people around him, he was no longer merely sick or strange, he was becoming frightening. Then a 14-month-old child disappeared, and immediately suspicion fell on him. However, there is no surviving evidence that Tarrare actually harmed the child. The accusation survives as part of the story attached to him, not as a proven fact. The suspicion does tell us something about how grimly people viewed him by that point. He was the sort of man onto whom others projected their horrors, so, like his parents, they drove him out. For several years, Tarrare vanishes from the record. When he reappears, it is 1798, and he is dying in a hospital at Versailles. He asks to see Percy again. By then, whatever had defined his life seemed finally to be destroying what remained of his body. Tarrare reportedly believed he knew the cause. He told Percy that years earlier he had swallowed a golden fork and that it remained lodged inside him. Percy didn't believe this. He suspected tuberculosis, and later summaries usually described Tarrare's final illness in that way. In any case, his end was miserable. He suffered severe prolonged diarrhea, weakened rapidly, and died not long afterward, likely at only about 26 years old. Even after death, his body disturbed those around him. Percy later wrote that decomposition began quickly and the smell was so unbearable that several surgeons refused to dissect him. Eventually, however, an autopsy was performed. They didn't find a fork. What they did find only deepened the mystery. His esophagus was said to be unnaturally wide. His stomach was enormous and ulcerated, filling much of the abdominal cavity. Other organs were diseased or enlarged. Pus was reportedly present throughout the body. The autopsy did not solve the case, but it convinced those who examined him that Tarrare had not simply been gluttonous. Something in him had been profoundly, physically wrong. But what was it? That question still has no certain answer. Modern speculation has included hypothyroidism, disorders involving the hypothalamus, metabolic disease, neurological damage, or some rare cause of extreme polyphagia. But retrospective diagnosis is always uncertain, and Tarrare's case is especially difficult. The record is incomplete, filtered through horror and curiosity, and tangled up with rumor. So he remains what he has long been, not merely a curiosity, but a real mystery. And perhaps this is why his story has endured. It would be easy to tell Tarrare's life as nothing more than a grotesque anecdote, a parade of repulsive details and medical oddities. Many have done exactly that. But there is something much sadder beneath it all. He was a poor man, almost certainly afflicted by some terrible condition, born into a world that did not know how to understand him, and really never truly tried. The public turned him into a spectacle, doctors turned him into a case, the military turned him into a tool, rumor turned him into a monster, and at no point was he treated as a human being first. That, more than any lurid detail, is what lingers. Tarrare is remembered because he seemed impossible. He stood at that unsettling boundary where history shades into legend, where medicine becomes fright, and where a real human life begins to feel like a nightmare. But there was a real man beneath the story, even if the story itself was later shaped by fright, peculiarity, and retelling. And whatever happened inside Tarrare's body, it ruined his life, long before it ended it.